I am extremely happy to be part of this AICTE sponsored faculty development program. I have had occasion to visit the Hindi department of CUSAT and have been greatly impressed by their academic and research activities. I congratulate the faculty and students of the department for organizing a national seminar, a national faculty development program on a very important, relevant topical subject, such as ecology and literature. I particularly congratulate the head of the department, Dr. Achita, and also the program coordinator, Dr. Prabhakaran, both of whom are very accomplished scholars of Hindi and comparative literature. It's a pleasure to be part of this ongoing program, and you have already listened to many lectures. So some of the ideas I present may have been already discussed, as I have not actually followed all the lectures in the program. But let me introduce, as a way of introducing my area of contemporary Malayalam green poetry, let me actually observe a few preliminary points. Any discussion on ecology and literature will involve a critical re-evaluation of the prevailing modes of literary criticism, their objectives and concerns, and the relation between art and society in the context of the massive reorganization of the literary field itself in the wake of many of the developments in the late 20th century. From 1990 onwards, we have been witnessing a number of theoretical and intellectual kind of intervention, raising very fundamental questions regarding what exactly is the idea of the literary, what the relation between the human and the non-human. Why do we actually use language as a mode of creating a world for our own expression, for our own effective, what you call, linkages with the world? These questions have actually assumed some urgency, mainly because there has been a shift of paradigms in both the way of writing, in the production of literature, and also in which literary criticism, the critical examination of literature, is actually conducted. I would actually argue that 1980s and 1990s were a period of massive transformation in the sensibility of Malayalam poetry. And we actually find a kind of end of a period. We very often describe it as the modernist phase in Malayalam poetry, which began sometime in the 50s, becomes a very well-defined period, very well-defined movement in the 60s and 70s. And by 70s, you can actually see a stage of self-criticism is emerging even within what you call the modernist mode of poetic writing. So modernism definitely revamped the very concept of what's the aesthetic of poetry, from progressive romantic phase to the modernist, meant a set of transformation in the manner in which the idea of poetry is actually taken forward. Particularly the experimental, avant-garde, high modernist idiom questioned a few assumptions about what's literature. Is its social function, the very idea of the commitment to the social. All these were subjected to several rounds of questioning. And what you had in the high modernist mode was a highly charged imagistic idiom, uninterrupted flow. If you read Ayyappa Panikar's Kurukshetram, some of the early works of N.N. Kakad or R. Ramachandran, or there are many poets, this first generation of high modernists in Malayalam poetry, they definitely revamped the very idiom of Malayalam poetry. They moved away from a very cloyingly sentimental and romanticized, idealistic way of looking at the world, and talked about disillusionment, mentioned the alienation the individual felt in society, and all this actually rendered poetry perhaps less popular. The face of modernist poetry also saw a certain kind of distance between the poetic literary field and the public sphere. The modernist poetry did not address issues which animated the public sphere. Maybe the invocation of the mythical and the metaphysical in a very dense, clustered idiom did not always communicate what essentially they were trying to actually convey. And a hermetic insular world of the aesthetic was the kind of modernist sublime. The modernist poetry created an insular world. Insular comes from the word island. If you know the poetry of Agni, Ajnay, Sachidananda, Hirananda, Vasyayan, he talks about Dvipata. You see, the whole idea of individual as an island, a certain kind of insularity. Again, took it to an extreme point. Something similar you can see in the modernist mode, even in Malayalam, where the individual's extreme isolation from the society, from the larger narratives of politics, from the larger questions of the public sphere, all these were defining features of the modernist mode. But around this time, I would like to draw your attention to a very important, maybe this was already discussed. Sometime in the 70s, there was a massive public movement, political movement in the wake of what you call government declaring a hydroelectric project in the Silent Valley. Kerala witnessed perhaps one of the first mass movements for environmental conservation from the mid-1970s onwards to preserve the Silent Valley rainforest in the Western Ghats, which was a unique ecosystem with rare species of plants and animals. And it was poets like Sugata Kumari and N.V. Krishnavarya who were in its forefront, mobilizing support and raising awareness of the significance of ecological issues across Kerala. And V. Krishna Warrior, being a very influential editor and commentator, played a very key role in mobilizing a social kind of consciousness against such wanton violation of pristine natural resources. So the genre of ecological writing comes of age in Malayalam during this phase, mainly through lengthy articles, commentaries, and also through creative writing, mainly through poetry. We have poems, Ayyappa Panikkar's Kadavida Makkale, D. Vinayendran's Kadu. Kadu means forest. Sugata Kumari has a number of poems where she laments the passing away of what you call the natural order and its deep significance for human survival on this planet. So environmentalist thought now becomes a very urgent day-to-day issue. It's no more an intellectual, what you call theory, abstraction discussed among conservatives or conservationists in the West. It becomes something that touches upon the everyday life of Kerala, a crisis which affects our own survival. And the first surge of green poetry in Malayalam happens during this phase. And I can actually mention several poets. Almost every poet worth his name, like Sachidanandan, KGS, Kadammanita, Kakad, almost everyone has contributed this to this phase of green poetry in Malayalam. And it did sensitize the reader. One of the major achievements of this phase of green poetry in Malayalam was to sensitize the reader to the issues which today we discuss under the eco-criticism or eco-philosophy or eco-feminism, etc. Though the clarity of such issues which we have today was not available to this first pioneering generation of green poets, it did actually make a break. And perhaps we need to actually give them some kind of credit for creating a tradition which is now developing into a major what they call the mainstream poetry of Malayalam. While examining this pioneering phase of green poets, I do need to draw some distinction, and this becomes essential for what I do subsequently in my presentation. You see, nature has been a major theme in the Romantic poetry. We do know from 18th century onwards, when Romantic phase in Indian poetry, across Indian poetry, you find Kumaran Ashan's very first poem, Veena Poovu, the fallen flower, that itself actually in a way changes the idiom in which Malayalam poet expresses himself. The entire poetic career of Kumaran Ashan can be discussed in the context of poetry and nature, because the world of nature plays a very important role in his evocation of the idea of spiritual, and his whole idea, the concept of love as a transcendental kind of human state, breaking barriers between the feminine and the masculine, between caste barriers, between a number of social barriers. So Kumaranashan, who is a pioneering romantic poet in Malayalam, does initiate a fresh perspective on the idea of how to write nature. But let us, I would like to distinguish between the stage in which nature is a major theme in poetry towards another phase, environmental poetry, and maybe a third phase we are going through today where we call it the ecological poetry. So they have certain common things, but they are also basically different in orientation. If you read a book like The Country and the City, written by Raymond Williams, he does describe how during the 18th century, England goes through a number of what you call reordering of society. There are the industrial estates are coming up. The city is becoming more and more populated, and it is attracting lots of people from the villages. So the migration from the rural to the urban, enclosures where a number of the property owned by city people are kept enclosed. And as a result, you find people increasingly getting alienated from their own environment. So what you witness in the poetry of Shelley or Keats or Wordsworth, nature becomes a means of confronting the after effects of industrialization and the consequent alienation it breeds in human society. Nature is a means of alleviating a certain kind of state of alienation from which man actually cannot find any kind of refuge or redemption. So this phase, I would like to argue that the manner in which nature is seen in romantic poetry still privileges the human. It is anthropocentric. When we use the word anthropocentric, maybe you are familiar with the term, it means man at the center. So you know the very famous poem by Wordsworth, Tintern Abbey, 5 long winters, 5 with the length, etc., etc. And he is describing his relation with nature, how nature has altered in his perspective over the last few decades. You see, when you put the human gaze at the center, nature becomes largely an object of meditation, an object of viewing, an object of relationship. And nature by itself does not actually participate in the poetic process here. And I will not go into the details of this, but definitely I will have a few things to say as I move forward. See, when we come to the environmental phase, and this is not nature poetry as such. When Ayyappa Panikar writes Kadavide Makkale or the D. Vinaychandran's card, it's a highly effective, emotionally charged invocation of a sense of impending disaster. There's a certain urgency there is a certain kind of deep empathy with a larger outer world where the human is also implicated, where the human is as much a part as it is the non-human. So the environmental phase, you will find very important 20th century poets when T.S. Eliot, even his poem called The Wasteland. So vegetation, the absence of vegetation in a way spelling, it spelled the end of the human ability to regenerate itself. So environmental themes were even very much embodied in the modernist poetry. You do find Wallace Stephens, or you find Robert Frost, Elizabeth Bishop. These are all poets, American, British, and you have any number of European poets, all of them lamenting of the effect of the mechanical machine order on the human being. And against this kind of a major, you can say, a kind of disastrous imagination. In fact, modernist imagination has been called as an imagination of disaster. You do find in many of these poets a certain apocalyptic is a theme, apocalyptic tone. I will mention two poems where this becomes very pronounced. If you read a poem like Sankramanam by Attu Ravivarma in Malayalam, a very important poem which comes out in the 70s, that poem still works within the modernist mode. Here you have an outcast woman condemned to lifelong hard labor and humiliation and dies a miserable animal-like death, is invoked in very stark details with no suggestion of redemption or salvation. But when toward the end of the poem, the poet actually talks about sort of metamorphosing her body into so many, like wolf, so many natural phenomena, in a way transforming her into a kind of vital force of nature itself. He is trying to actually exorcise this woman who was condemned to the worst kind of abject life to a regenerating force of nature. You have an attempt to capture a dimension which was absent in the modernist idiom. But let me be very clear that Sankramanam works within the modernist mode, high modernist mode, and there is a kind of imagistic structure, very innovatively imagistic structure, which is at odds with the stark details of dehumanization of a life lived in abject misery. So the point I'm making is the aesthetic which operates in Sankramanam conceals the ethical issues which perhaps the poem is moving towards. It actually is groping towards an ethical kind of frame. And that becomes, for me, the basic defining feature of the ecological phase of postmodern poetry. You see, from environmental to ecological, the major shift that happens in the poetic mode is the very idea of the aesthetic, a certain ideology of the aesthetic now gives way to a certain perception of the ethical as an ingredient of the aesthetic. And this becomes a very important feature. I'll be taking it up in subsequent when I discuss F. Joseph, at least 5 to 6 poets I'll be discussing as contemporary green poets, because I have to make a selection. It's not possible to. Malayalam poetry is passing through one of its most prolific and also in a way prolix phase of composition. Perhaps for every one short story writer, there are 10 or 20 poets. Maybe for every literary critic, there are 50 or 100 poets. No critical evaluation of contemporary Malayalam poetry is possible because of its plurality, and the social media has made it a highly, what you call, spread out kind of sprawling form. There is no center. One of the things you find towards the end of the 19th century, and also, sorry, toward the end of 20th century, the mainstream of Malayalam poetry loses its centrality. There is no center, and peripheries have started speaking. And when peripheries, margin speak, you definitely have a new aesthetic, and they question the very assumptions about literature which were held as sacred over 1.5 centuries. So what Malayalam poetry is going through today is a period of highly, you can say, democratized expression, where poetic itself is not singular. Poetic itself is not something which can be tabulated and defined in a textbook format. So this transformation itself becomes a very interesting. Recently, when I gave a lecture on the Ayuba Panikar Memorial Lecture on the transition, the afterlife of Ayuba Panikar, I was trying to actually map, and I found this entire mapping contemporary Malayalam poetry, even the major trends, becomes an arduous task. But let me get back to the earlier point. When you look at a poem like Kochile Vrikshangal, Trees of Kochi, again written in the 70s, you do find a certain anxiety about the entire question of changing landscapes, the ecological crisis that underlines the predatory impulse of a accumulative capitalist society. That becomes the major theme. But if you look at this poem in greater details, the middle part of the poem mentions a certain kind of poetic tradition where Ashan, Changambura, Idapalli, Vailopalli, P. Kuniraman Nair, all are mentioned. So Kochile Vrikshangal operates within a kind of canonical Malayalam poetic tradition. It finds the canon still an essential component of poetic sensibility. And definitely toward the end of the poem, the poet does talk about an apocalyptic the image of the toxic smoke choking the living world on a pyre lit by the raw firewood of excuses, our lifelong cremation. In our eyes, nose, tongue, in our little obstinacies, around the back, the watch and the dream of the future, on the tiny feet long before the shoes, the octopus arms of smoke wind up for the crushing embrace. Definitely the poem, The Trees of Kochi, addresses a catastrophic onset of environmental damage, environmental destruction. And we need to actually see the poems which we have mentioned so far are still operating within the larger, what we call the anthropocentric tradition. And they have their roots largely in a worldview which can only be described as constrained and circumscribed and closed. And this is where I find to move from the environmental to the ecological is to become aware of a larger crisis in our very sensory apparatus, in our very imaginative capacity. I would use the observations of a very well-known philosopher, an Italian called Agamben, Giorgio Agamben. He talks about the anthropological machine, which creates a kind of absolute separation of the idea of the human and the non-human. You see, he asked, there is a book by him called The Open, where he examined the relation between man and animal. And he examines how this idea of man itself is constructed over the last maybe 2000 years or so, philosophical investigations, scientific inquiries. All this in a way contributed to the construction of a domain called the human. But this was done at the cost of exclusions. We have excluded the animal to create a domain called the human. And privileging the human, we have also suppressed some of the basic elements which we inhabit, which we, you see, and in 19th century itself, poets could recognize this. And there were very strong, you see, reactions. Agamben uses a poem by Rilke. And Rilke has in his a series of, elegies. He has one elegy, number 8. He talks about how the animal sees the world as open. You see, I am quoting a few lines from Rilke. The creature gazes into openness with all its eyes. But our eyes are as if they were reversed, surrounded everywhere like barriers against its free passage. So Rilke is suggesting that we humans are constrained and confined by our humanness, unable to see beyond us. So anthropocentric vision is a kind of what we call circumscribed worldview, which excludes not only animality as a principle of organizing the world, but as a principle of creativity, as a principle of organizing the human world itself. So as we move into the 21st century, so let me address the contemporary ecological phase of green poetry. The ecological awareness has deepened into a complex vision of multiple strands encompassing issues of socio-political identity, such as caste, race, gender, religion, etc. It also encompasses questions of the capitalist modes of development that have resulted in irreversible damages to the ecosystem of the planet. And it also takes up for analysis epistemological models of analysis rooted in the Enlightenment modernity that have sustained, as I said earlier, the anthropological machine, which Agamben says. This process of excluding the human and the animal, you see, you create a category called whether it is the old philosophical ideology or the new scientific, particularly the Darwinian, scientific ideology, the animal has to be excluded to create a privileged sphere of the human. And in the process, the human becomes an empty space with no essential defining features. Because the human is seen as not animal. You see, it is defined in negative terms. The human becomes a privileged space. But by being not animal, does it become what? What exactly is, quote unquote, human? That's where philosophy or science is faced with a certain kind of, aporia, a certain kind of lack of. So we do find the binaries such as nature, culture, body, mind, subject, object, inside, outside, center, margin, male and female. We can multiply, the binaries. They become the manner in which we actually engage with the world of the real, the phenomenological world. And it is, let's take Agamben's book, the title, The Open. You see, the question of engaging with the idea of the open, that itself becomes a question of shedding the baggage, the ideological baggage of the aesthetic. I mentioned earlier, the ideology of the aesthetic. A certain, I quote here a poem by S. Joseph. This is one of the finest poets of the first 2 decades of 21st century in Malayalam. He has a poem called Letter to Malayalam Poetry. And he sees Malayalam poetry, the canonical Malayalam poetry, as largely elitist. He says, I have seen you going in the car, returning from the temple. It moves among the privileged. And he speaks in first person singular, I live among the poor in a thatched house like theirs. I eat what comes my way. I have to bring water from far. Father calls me a dog. I have to clean up mother's shit and piss. I pick and sell tin, sandals, bottles, paper. People call me rag picker. Public buses do not halt for me. You see, rag picker, poet as a rag picker. He picks up the waste. And the world of the waste is what development has largely given rise to. And unknowingly, we have all become rag pickers. We do not know how much waste, our own, from e-waste to plastic waste to whatever. And we actually see our life being choked. But then I am not going into that. Maybe Joseph never meant all that. You see, he invites Malayalam poetry into this open world of waste where he lives among the, the abject. And you see, he says, here you are not living in a domestic space where you have fridge or you have dining table. You may trip and fall because so many objects of your desire surround you. So he tells Malayalam poetry, you wanted freedom. Yes, here it is in abundance. You can do what you feel like. You can bathe in a stream. You can coo with common cuckoos. Sit on a mat in the veranda. Gaze at the sky. With my parents, owls will hoot and you will get scared. Then I will hold you tight with love. You see, this poem, in its tone, has the ease of a conversational kind of easygoing everyday relation, engagement. So the modernist sublime gives way to a certain self-awareness. I would even use this self-reflexivity about in what way language is functioning in society. You see, the consciously, hermeneutically, constructed aesthetic of high modernism distance itself from the popular, the everyday, the plane in which we experience sensuous. Some critics have used the word sensorium. There is a sensuous, when I touch, when I hear somebody cry, when I actually sort of feel something in my mouth. You see, there is this question of relating to the world through our everyday sensorium. And that Malayalam poetry is reclaiming an ecological dimension of a poem like this has to be located in its search for a certain ethical position with reference to the creation of the literary. Here's a poem called Basket, Kotta in Malayalam. And here basket weaving, which is a community activity, people bring, they bring bamboos and creepers and a lot of items from the open world, near the pond, near the stream, and sit together, sing, drink black coffee. And gradually a basket takes shape. You see, and he says when its form is taking shape, it looks like a little sun. And then, of course, it grows, and now it becomes a sky. And if you put it above you, it can actually conceal you. And you see, the entire manual work, the idea of, there is a kind of, coming down to the minimal. The poem is coming down to the minimal world of subsistence. Of course, toward the end of the poem, he says, now the palmyra, fronds, bamboos, creepers, they are gone, they have become scarce, and songs have stopped. A certain community has got broken up. So ecological poetry is not about the vanishing of a certain way of life alone. It's also about the community breaking up. You see, the migration to cities, and you see the raw materials for basket making. Now you will have plastic baskets in your house. And Roland Barthes has a very interesting, in his mythologies, he says there was a time when from cradle to coffin, everything was made of wood. You see, wood in a way allows you to touch. There is a sensory experience of being related to the tree, the wood. But once all these become synthetically made, something goes out of your life. Something actually, you become more and more, like the waste among which you live. You see, there is another, I don't want to go into these poems. I will just mention there is the Ennavum Aksharavum. In memory of Pradeepan Pambirikunnu, he has written a poem where, you see, in a way, he is mentioning in the context of Pradeepan Pambirikunnu was a very, he died young, very important. He was emerging as a major critic in Malayalam, a very good commentator, cultural commentator. Also, he has written a novel. So he was in search of a distinctive tradition of Dalit writing. And where can you find the roots of Dalit imagination? So in this poem, Joseph actually talks about a journey into the forest, into the interior. And you find him the images of the burning tree, bamboo thickets simmering with fireflies. It's a very strong poem, though it becomes diffuse at some points, but definitely in the invocation of what I have earlier mentioned as the open, this poem actually marks a very important, in a way, stance towards the ecological vision of modern Malayalam poetry. So Joseph seems to suggest that you cannot separate issues of environment from livelihood, community, labor, breakdown of human bonds under the pressure of urbanization and globalization. So there are issues which you can see him as a Dalit poet as well, but there is a new kind of aesthetic in a poem like Kotta, the basket. You see, labor itself as creative, labor itself as a community activity. The whole idea of individual as poet, individual as the creator of meaning is put under certain kind of question mark. I will briefly mention Virankutti, another important poet who deserves special mention because he has renovated the idiom of Malayalam poetry to a great extent. Is one of his early poems about house. The very idea of house, he deconstructs the idea of the house. If you take away the walls, if the walls do not belong to the room doesn't exist. The house doesn't exist. We have created a privileged space around us in the domestic domain. And this in a way makes us imprisoned, caged. So the whole dialectic of inside, outside, home and the world, the whole idea of inner and outer is the creation of demarcating boundaries. And as I said earlier, the anthropological machine operates in our mind, in our what you call intellectual training, in our cultural kind of vocabulary, by constantly look at the caste system, how it demarcates space. You see, the whole question of touch, untouchable, touchable, space itself is demarcated. The power operates through demarcating space. Perhaps the most powerful demarcation of space is in the territorial marking of the nation and the nation state. Perhaps we have lost the ability to look at the planet, what actually concerns mankind as a whole, largely because we have been reduced to territorial creatures with no sense of a whole. We are permanently trapped in a sense of lack, where we see everything as enemy territory. We see the neighbor as a threat. We see the encroaching, projects everything actually is, there is nothing where we relate as ourselves. Maybe a few tribals living in complete anonymity have still retained a sense of space as the open, sense of space as something not demarcated. So when you leave the house, you surrender yourself to the open, to the logic of animality. Man no more exists as a possible subject for poetry. So Virankuti communicates this. How can you see, find similes or metaphors for man, human being? What's human? The crisis I mentioned earlier, I think Virankuti senses that crisis by constantly invoking the false categories which have upheld, reinforced the idea of the human and the new human as watertight compartments. So man or the human become the limit beyond which imagination or threshold inquiries cannot move. Our institutions, conceptual categories, desires, even mode of imagining, they are all dictated by a normative rooted in the human. And this renders inaccessible multiple worlds that we inhabit. We do not see. And that's where a number of poems by, he has a very interesting poem about in the nursing home of trees, where you actually, he describes trees in various stages of decay. Is it possible to imagine trees? Of course, there is the human intervening here, but still the tables are turned. You are entering, when you talk about a nursing home for trees, where you see the very idea that it in a way reforms you, and you see it also rejuvenates you. If it relates to the open in a much more meaningful way than, you see, looking at the beauty of trees. The poets of the 21st century had no choice but to leave behind the semantic baggage of grand narratives that were sustained by the bandwagon of modernity. So there is a poem called On a Photograph. Virankuti speaks of a butterfly that comes to rest on a photograph on a war scene. Everything in that photograph is dead. But here is a butterfly, a very small butterfly sitting on that war scene photograph. Nobody even remembers what the war was about or how many perished in those battles. And the butterfly intervenes between the soldiers, two soldiers lying dead with, you see, their guns drawn. Perhaps if they had seen the butterfly when they were about to fight, they would have actually embraced each other. They would have even danced together. You see, before they recovered their sense of duty and again take position with the rifle, they would have been human with the sense of the other. You see, if butterfly had actually appeared as a vision much before. You see, he says the industrial, perhaps this question toward the end he asks, how can we say that this butterfly which is sitting there, you see, could have been related to that butterfly which can intervene between those two dead soldiers? You see, there is an attempt to move out of focus. War has been, in fact, modern capitalist industrial complex is largely a war machine. We forget that even internet was basically created by Pentagon for its own defense strategies. Most of the major breakthroughs in science have come largely because investment for defense. And this industrial military complex shapes the direction of globalization, and it perpetuates through perennial narratives of progress and human flourishing. Basically, what we forget is the very idea of progress or development cannot actually accommodate the concerns. You see, it benefits not even the entire human community. It benefits even during the COVID lockdown period. We find the wealth of the corporate world has multiplied in many folds, whereas the common people have become more and more impoverished. The absolute number of poor people in India has almost gone up by 10 to 20%. We forget we live in a world where everything cannot be integrated into one. You see, globalization is an attempt to standardize the world, whether it's culture, entertainment, everything becomes Hollywoodization, Disneyfication, everything becomes a massive reorganization according to the priorities of a very hegemonic, what I said as the industrial military complex. And that's why the multiple time frames in which we live, you see, there is the time of seasonal cycle, there is the time river takes to move from the mountain to the sea. There's a time for the seed to move and germinate, become a plant. And there is a time seedling takes to become a tree. There is a time starlight it takes to reach earth. So the human time is just one among many. Even, you see, the animals around you, the insects, we are all now focused on an invisible virus and how it behaves. And we are caught in the mystery of this very microscopic kind of, it's not even living, whether it's a virus is neither living nor non-living. Do we know the mystery of life itself? You see, in one of the poems, Viranguti communicate there is a yew tree in a Scotland botanical garden which flowered after a wait of 3,000 years. It had only the male, but then one branch became female also. So it actually, you see, one branch of a tree, male tree, becomes female and it germinates. So what's this mystery of life? You see, and have you seen around in your own house compound, there are papayas which are sometimes male, female, or there are gooseberry, nellimaram. He talks about the nellimaram on his compound, which he has not produced any gooseberries, but he is hopeful. You see, trees do not live in our time frame. It's a mystery. You see, how do they? You see, there are botanists who argue trees can talk. When a tree is withering nearby, the tree which is green and erect with its own roots, it actually tries to feel the tree which is in distress. So let's not assume feelings are confined to only the human world. There is a certain communication happening between the monkey and the tree, or the tree and the birds and maybe the animals living in water. You see, the world is always in communion. This is not a poetic, idealistic kind of phrase. When you disrupt the rhythm, which you see, maybe you are building a 6-lane highway or you are building a high-speed railway. When you disrupt, you see, a certain ecosystem beyond, you see, a certain limit, nature speaks back. Nature may take 1,000 years or 1 lakh years to speak. You see, maybe the virus is one of the manner in which the nature speaks back. Definitely, now scientists are trying to actually, how does a mountain speak to you? It has a way of the kind of landslides which are threatening the living communities living in high ranges in Kerala. Mountain is speaking. Western Ghats are actually loud and clear. Yes, enough is enough. Can you hear us? So this sound of the mountains is something which our so-called development driven political industrial nexus cannot really understand. He has a poem about a man who is confined to a bed in a hospital room. And there is a branch of a tree which comes sometimes into view through the window. And sometimes that very sight of a small branch of a tree fills him with excitement. It becomes a vision of reassurance, redemption. And Virankuti wonders if one should pray for the leaf. That's another poem. You see, for a man confined to such a situation, even it becomes a vision. You don't see the tree, you don't see the leaf, you don't see the sky. Maybe you have to, the idea of the sacred, which is embodied in the bonding between the living beings, it is something we have absolutely no sense of. Yes, he also has, sorry. The very idea of language, for example, Heidegger uses one way in which man creates a human world is through language. But is language the only way of communicating? He talks about gestures. There's a poem called The School of Gestures. And he actually says, Virankuti is saying, words come alive in gestures, and gestures existed much before words, and they were born before language, and their craftsmanship of molding sculptures needing the sky continues. Gestures see language as a child still learning to walk. They can lose it, language can lose its way if not accompanied by gestures. Language is a helpless child. It needs a helping hand or it will die. You see, the very idea of fragmentariness, the very idea of marginal, there is a poetic operating in Virankuti's poetry, which I would actually call the aesthetic of fragmentariness and the incomplete. You see, you can, the well-wrought on, the idea of poetry is a well-finished artifact, like Ode to Nightingale, or you see the very romantic concept of a poem as a finished product, embellished, decorated, and dhuni, and you see vakroti, everything adding to its great dense structure. That itself, in a way, affirms a sort of demonic in the human. There is an attempt to conquer and create a kind of territory. There is an attempt to assert one's individuality, maybe in the inaudible way in which he talks, in the unassertive tone in which he observes. There is an aesthetic. You see, this is not a movement toward the sublime. He sees the world as a semiotics of gestures where each movement slides into the other, making a texture of interconnections. And that's why you see nothing, the house where you are sleeping may be built on a place where there was a pond or a river. You see, the place remembers. Your memories maybe go back to 10 years, the place remembers maybe 20 years, suddenly you find news that a river has come into parts of Madras city, Chennai city. The river was there before the city was built, and river remembers its path, and we have actually perhaps forgotten, and we need to listen to what the world actually. You see, when you talk about, I have mentioned ecological vision in the context of Joseph and Virankuti. I mentioned Sugata Kumari. You see, women poets have been very sensitive to the asymmetrical power relation in society and the bearing on the ecosystem. In fact, the very term ecology comes from the word oikos. It's a Greek word which means household, hearth. It's the place where you cook food. So the women are much closer to the idea of the ecological than men. Maybe it's the masculine which has taken over the earth and shaped it after its own image and created this highly defective anthropological machine, which is still driving, you see, it's damaging kind of ideas of progress, development, etc. So, you see, at the very root of ecology is a close linkage between the economy of everyday domestic labor and the rhythm of a woman's life. I will mention Vijayalakshmi, a very important Malayalam poet. I have written on her poetry in Malayalam. So she has a poem called Martha, one of the early, this must have been in the 80s. It was the last living passenger pigeon, and it died in a Cincinnati zoo in America. There were only 5 or 10 birds left. And finally, it was only this one bird. They called it Martha, Washington's, in memory of Washington's wife or someone. So Martha was actually the last surviving bird. Then it dies, a species dies, an entire, what you call a particular living thing loses its entire species. So how, you see, extinction itself sends a shiver across when a language becomes extinct, when a species becomes extinct. In a way, it moves you because it's something that threatens your own existence as well. And there are many such poems where a very deep awareness about the environmental crisis comes in her poetry. Madangam, a poem where she identifies with an elephant which rushes through the forest in blind fury. The Animal Trainer, Mrigashitshakan, a very important poem where the metaphor of the domesticated animal signifies the oppressed state of the woman trapped in a disastrous marriage. All this, we may say, is anthropocentric to a great extent. But then her poetry has grown. I will mention a recent poem from the last collection also. My Name is Hiroshima, where she is critical of the hegemonic powers of what I said earlier, the military-industrial complex, which is ruling over our earth, sky, and water. I quote a few lines. Displaying an entry ticket to hell, he says, dollar is a synonym of God, conjuring the broken heart, peeled fingers, melting soul, and the pain of cancer into paper plane. I resist him till the last breath. So question of resistance does figure in the poetry of women poets in Malayalam. I have many poets to mention here. We have Girija, Anida Thambi, Muttamadikkumbo while sweeping the courtyard. a woman's everyday activity. You see, the lines the broom makes are somehow, you see, they become significant. They are like the lines of a composition. The courtyard itself becomes her composition, a work of making. So making itself becomes, it assumes multiple meanings. And women's activity, particularly nursing, making, cooking, or relating, or providing care, caring, all these are actually seen from a totally different perspective, which is where the male is no more a privileged position. Perhaps ecological has moved to a domain of ethical questions, largely because it is much more inclusive now. It's not something which addresses the world of what you call, nobody writes about the flower and the beautiful, and you see, that's not ecological poetry. It's not like Robert Frost saying, stopping by woods on a snowy evening. You see, it's the human is speaking. From there, we have moved to a larger, very complex ethical apprehension of the world as composed of interconnected life forms. You see, in Savitri Rajivan's poem, body becomes a very central metaphor. Metaphor of relating, metaphor of reaching out. A poem like Ammaye Kulipikumbol, as you bathe your mother, she bonds with her own old mother, who is now sick and old, reviving her, and in the process, memories of their bonding and her own childhood. So the act of nursing the invalid mother becomes a metaphor for plumbing into something vital within. When you reach out, you are also, in a way, reaching into the resources of your own ability to empathize, to create. It's a creative act of claiming your place in the world. In a very important poem, Dehandaram, metamorphosis of the body, or I would say the trans body. You see, this whole binary of body and soul, we have always, you see, in a way celebrated the metaphysical at the cost of the physical. We have never been able to, the body is all that we have. It's the body which binds us. It's my leg which moves on the earth. It's the pain which I feel, which actually I understand the weather, or it is the world outside always talking to my skin. You see, this whole idea of the bifurcation of the body and the soul, it has created a false, kind of understanding of our own self. I quote from this poem, the Handaram. Grandmas maintained that it was possible to exist without a body, merely as soul or ghost or illusion, like Yakshi atop a Palmyra. She never noticed her body till she recovered her eyesight to view it from the outside. You see, she is in a way talking about how her training, the way she was trained in the domestic, her own family atmosphere, she was never allowed to see her body as something meaningful, central, and life-giving. It was something to be hidden, concealed, not to actually be thought of. But she says, I discovered my body. It's like somebody coming and discovering a continent. That's why she says, like India got a map, is it like Gama coming to Vasco da Gama coming to India, you see there is this colonial discovery, so there is a new kind of age. So I moved to a new age, and like India got a map, I got a body. The sailor taught me that there is an ocean in the body. Rising waves are the man-made ships, voyage across it, rainbow colors and skies reflect in it, and conflicts and armors love shimmer upon it, yet which hitherto undiscovered continent is my body. My body is still an undiscovered continent. Which hitherto undiscovered continent is my body, this body. I think its translation is by, I have used translations by A.J. Thomas, Aditya Shankar. I have used my own translation wherever is a. So this I think is by A.J. Thomas. So this question of whose, you see, my body is an undiscovered continent. It's through exclusion of the non-human that we produce the human. The body is produced as a seat of carnal desires, physical passion. All these are actually seen threatening. You see, the very idea of carnal pleasures. So you have to sublimate the body into a spiritual being. So that's why you produce a metaphysical you see, historical, transcendental domain of the spiritual to suppress the body. And this narrative of the spiritual in a way reinforces all other divisions we have mentioned, like subject, object, man, woman, male, female, etc. The women poets attempt to recover continuities between the female body and its environment of attachments, entanglements, passions, and relations, which were in a way suppressed, which were erased through a certain narrative of the spiritual. In the othering of the human body, there was also a certain kind of denial, creating man as a kind of lack. You see, it is the logic of these deliberate exclusions. One could also go back to a whole history of exclusion, which creates categories like victimization. How is the Jew produced? How is the what you call the aboriginal produced? How is the slave produced? You see, there is this new book, some of you must have seen, Amitav Ghosh, the Nutmeg Curse. He says, you see, you can only colonize when you reproduce those places, those people as is inferior to you. So there is a knowledge system, there is a philosophical narrative which in a way empowers and enables you in colonization. So from 15th century, it's a new phase of philosophy and science, particularly science, which enabled the Europeans to feel as superior. And it is this, you see, the genocides they carry out wherever they have gone. They have actually for raw material, for plundering, you see, and their place, the spices, etc. They have had no sense of guilt in, you see, exterminating large, you see, groups of people in Africa, in parts of Asia, in South America. America itself is built on the bones of the Aboriginal Indians. So how do you actually, you see, so the history of this violence is this is the violence modernity has always legitimated as, you see, through its knowledge systems, through its anthropological kind of, you see, modes of analysis. So we need to, you see, In this context, I will read a poem by Ashalata. Ashalata is a very important woman poet writing in Malayalam, writes not very prolifically, but a poem called Jadikayude Totem, The Garden of Nutmegs. Maybe Amita Ghosh's title, The Nutmeg, is already there. It's a spice, Jadika. So in the poem, The Garden of Nutmegs, Ashalada revisits the myth of the fall in the Garden of Eden. There's a grandmother here who can see through the game of the entire idea of, the God cursing man or cursing the world. She says it's a kind of, the poet herself seems to be a modern feminist who is reading Simone de Beauvoir and Judith Butler, but grandma seems to be a liberated woman with absolutely no compunction about defying all the dictates of the God, all the commandments of God. When she says, how can we enter the Garden of Nutmeg? Maybe he has said, meaning God. She says all that was rumors, he floated, she says. There's no snake. She says all these are his rumors. The garden with its lush green and colorful fruits is a sensuous body itself. You can read this garden as the sensuous body. All about it is forbidden. Sexuality itself is seen as a forbidden area for the woman to relate or woman to discuss or openly even mention. So there are descriptions. You see, the grandmother pulls her and tells her, come on, they climb the wall. And grandmother is so powerful, she even pulls her up and they jump into the garden. And it's a narration, but this luscious garden, green garden with all kinds of fruits hanging low, definitely is the carnal world of sensual pleasures. The sensorium in its most glaring details is described in the poem. But the poet, the speaker in the poem says, my hand stood frozen, unable to raise a stone. There stood the whole garden with the rich fragrance of temptation. This is what our, education, our training, our domestication, our what we call received knowledges, they allow us not to relate ourselves to the world outside. You see, the world, there are forbidden things. There are words which we cannot, even utter. There are experiences which should be unspoken. Grandma, who had violated the commands of God, has no sense of guilt, and she was unable to understand her inability to cross the line set by patriarchy and institutions. And she says, with due apologies for using a four-letter word, because in original Malayalam also she uses, again, this idea of what is Teri in Malayalam with respect to cinema, this is being, what is vulgarity? The whole idea pure, impure. Grandmother says, what kind of a fucking feminist are you? You can't even raise a hand to pluck a fruit. Grandmother says, what kind of feminist, what kind of bold woman are you? Poet as a woman academic, well-grounded in the theories of Simone de Beauvoir and Judith Butler, still find it hard to accept the body, its pleasures, and a whole set of ideas or ideologies rooted in the physical. It's not body, the garden alone. It's also a larger question of liberating ourselves from the question of power relations as ordained by modernity. You see, there is a poem by Virankutti I mentioned here on Teri. You see, when writing a beautiful poem in sublime language, a very naughty, very, very vulgar word comes in, and the poet doesn't know how to, you see, engage with it. You see, what do you do with? But then these are words which have saved you from, maybe you did not murder a person because you could utter that abuse. You see, a theory must have actually saved you. You see, they are all loaded with human emotional energy. And of course, we should debate. Bakhtin in its theory of carnival says how the marketplace, the whole language of what we call abuse, all this at some level also becomes life-giving. It resurrects something which is communal, collective, the spirit of, you see, when aesthetic becomes official, there is a kind of official aesthetic, a textbook kind of idea of poetry. You can only resist it, you can only go beyond it by breaking what is what you call poetic, what is allowed in poetry, what is not allowed in poetry. You see, all these are commandments, which the question of ecological also is about commandments of not only patriarchy, but every hegemonic institution, which in a way breeds violence and creates divisions. So I will end with a very short reference to a very recent poem by KGS, Tagari and the Magical Horse, Tagari Mandriga Kudirayum. Tagari Shivshankar Pillai, a very well-known novelist, is very renowned, he is no more. But in the poem by KGS, he says, Tagari one night wakes up with a nightmare. The nightmare is his paddy is being stolen by someone. And he runs to the field with torch, sticks, and his companions to find a towering figure of his own. You see, there was a veteran peasant, Kandan Moopen, you see, who always led all agricultural activity in the village. He was there even before Tagadi reached there. And Krishiyude Rishi, this is what KGS writes. Kandan Moopen, the ordinary peasant who has so much local knowledge about all ideas of farming in Kutanad, he was in the field before Tagadi reaches there. And he tells Tagadi that he had sensed something odd happening in the field, and he had, he also comes back from the dead. And there it was. What disturbed them, the nightmare was a magic horse grazing in the paddy violet. 3 persons high, very tall, pristine white, with fiery tongue. It was like a Trojan horse. Out of this horse came battalions of maybe other horses, and the field they were grazing now have turned barren, like a desert. And Kandan Moopen says his followers chased the magical horse away, and its tail continued to wave in the wind like the trail of smoke left by a bomber in its path, blinding him. And the paddy field is now a traumatized, it lies traumatized, violated, emitting pungent smell of chemicals that corrupts everything in the vicinity. Paddy, fish, cricket, grass shoots, water snakes, fog, water plants, even language, words spoken. You see, in a way, KGS is telling us the story of green revolution. KGS telling us what fertilizers have done to our soil, what new kinds of technological advancement in corporate agriculture have done to the one of the oldest professions practiced by human beings, that is farming. So an entire ecosystem is now, if you know, some of you, if you know, there are belts in Punjab, which actually once used to be known as the granary of India, they actually have become cancer belt. The excessive use of fertilizers. In Kerala itself, we know endosulfan. There are entire, Ambika Sudan Mangad has written several stories. A. Rahman has written, Ambika Sudan Mangad has an entire novel about, it's translated into Malayalam, Enmagaje as Sorga. All these are works which we can term as ecological. So here, an archetypal figure of a very old peasant, this Kandan Mopan. He represents an order of things where the human and the non-human relations were not exploitative. They were not predatory. And the onslaught of the corporate giants into the agriculture now threatens to destroy an ecosystem of local knowledge, community bonds rooted in everyday culture of storytelling, ballads, fairs, and festivals through mighty resources that can turn institutions and intelligentsia into their favor. Maybe ecological poetry of the ecological variety is one of those stages where its mode of resistance becomes the essential instrument of maintaining an ethical order in our own postmodern globalized world. I'll stop here. It's 1 o'clock. And maybe if there are questions, I can answer them. Let me say Malayalam poetry as it appears today is a very complex, varied. It's always a risk mentioning some poems, omitting many. Even if I start mentioning names, it may take 10 to 15 minutes to mention some of the most important poets. So I have actually followed it as argument and used poems which can substantiate the argument. Thank you.